Hello, everyone. I am so excited for this YA fantasy debut panel. I'm sorry that I cannot think of like any other names to name these panels. I was looking at the list on the YouTube channel. I was like, these are all going to be the same thing, like fantasy debut panel. But it's not words are not really necessarily like what I'm great at. But anyway, I'm so excited to be chatting with these fantasy debuts. Just a quick note about me, if you didn't know who I am. My name's Lily. I'm kind of like the face behind the Utopia State of Mind on the internet. And yeah, that's all you really need to know. So we're going to be chatting with these authors, and everyone's going to kind of give like a brief bio and then about their book as well. And then we'll jump into questions. Also, if you have any questions that you have, please drop them in the chat throughout or at the end, whenever you want. And I will try to remember to go back when it's the Q&A portion. So do you want to start, Kaylee?
Sure. My name's Kaylee. I'm a fantasy author from Louisiana, and my book is A Ruinous Fate, which is about a witch named Calla whose destiny is tied to these magic artifacts called witch's dice. And Calla kind of ends up being like very, very cursed because of these dice. And so she has to go into this demonic enchanted forest to reset her fate. So just a lot of witchy fun. Um, I don't know if there's like any other interesting facts about me, to be honest, except the fact that I write books and I have a lot of dogs.
Do you want me to go next? I might as well. Okay. I'm MK Lob. My debut is Seven Faces Saints. It came out this month, actually, with Little Brown. It is a young adult fantasy murder mystery about two childhood friends turned enemies who have to team up together to solve a series of murders happening in their city. It's got some romance, a couple horror elements, but I think it's more of a fun book than a dark book in most aspects. Yeah, I live in Canada here. It's getting dark, and that's all I have to say.
Hello, I am Maya Ibrahim. I am the debut author of Spice Road, which is an epic fantasy set in an Arabian-inspired land. Basically follows a 17-year-old named Amani who has lived her life defending her nation from the monsters that lurk in the sands, but then she must fight to find her brother, who she discovers that his betrayal might threaten her entire nation. I live in Sydney, Australia, and that's why I have a funny accent. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Okay, all of these sound so good, I can almost forget my book. But hi, I'm Lissa Mia Smith, and I am the author of Revel, which is a young adult romantic fantasy inspired heavily by Moulin Rouge that takes place in like 1920s Prohibition era New York. And was there anything else interesting about me other than write? I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am a New Yorker myself, although right now I'm in Vermont. So if the background looks strange and it gets a little dark, that's because I don't know what the lighting's going to be like here in the evening. But I'm very happy to be here with y'all.
Perfect. Okay. I had so many questions when I was thinking about this, so I really had to pare it down for the questions here. So I picked my favorites and I don't really know where to start. But the first thing I'll start off with is kind of a basic question, but what draws you or what drew you to fantasy as sort of a reader and a writer? And sort of the second part of the question is how did your book first come to you? So who do I want to start? MK, do you want to start?
Yes, just let me unmute myself. So I have always loved fantasy, honestly. I started off reading fantasy when I was really young with the Magic Treehouse books. I don't know if anyone read those, which I think is also why I'm so interested in like historical kind of fantasy. And it's just what I've read my whole life, which is not really a great answer, but I feel like when you start with something, you tend to follow through with it. So that's just what I've loved since I was a kid. And I guess for the second part of it, My debut came to me when I wanted to write a murder mystery fantasy. I didn't know how I wanted to do it, but I knew that I wanted it to have like kind of a crime feel, but also be high fantasy, which was my first love. So I kind of put together the world first, and then decided I would add in those murder aspects as I went. And I am not a very good plotter. I usually write a really messy draft and then go back and plot afterwards. So it definitely came to me in like bits and pieces, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in off of that. I'd say it's sort of similar for me, where I grew up reading anything I can get my hands on, but particularly fantasy and YA fantasy. And I actually had written some science fiction before because I really enjoy that too. But I was trying to write something contemporary because I thought that would help me get an agent and a book deal, because contemporary always sells. And I just kept trying to add magic into a contemporary story, and it wasn't working whatsoever. And so I never actually finished that, although I got pretty close. But around, I guess, like the 75% mark on that manuscript, I went to Moulin Rouge on Broadway. And when you sit in that audience, you're just in this room that is, it's like all this lush red crimson velvet, and there are people dancing slowly, and there's like a single instrument playing, and it hasn't even started yet. And everything's glittery and sparkling. And I'm like, this should be a fantasy novel. And that's like the seed of the idea hit me. And then I ditched the other project and I ran with this one. I couldn't let it go.
I love that. I had a similar experience with how, like, my book kinda came to be. But to start off with, I also, like, grew up reading fantasy mostly because my grandfather read it to me, so that was, like, my very formative experience with it, and then I had a really rough middle school life, which is when I really became a reader, so fantasy was, like, escapism, so, like, I could kinda, like, get out of the real world, and I just, like, never went back. But I also, like, had an experience where something just clicked for me and I abandoned all my other projects because it was during COVID, and my partner and I were virtually playing board games, like, every night with all of our friends because we were stuck inside all the time, and I lost a game of Monopoly and, got really upset about it just because I made a bad dice roll, and the story kinda just clicked in my head, and I went back to a book that I had kind of been, like, dabbling with for years and years, and it was like, "Oh, this finally all makes sense." So, that's pretty fun.
I love, yeah, whenever it's like one of my brothers is like, "Hey, let's get together and play Monopoly." I'm like, "Okay, so you want to fight then?" So I guess for me, I'm the same in the sense that I really got into fantasy, I guess, as escapism when I was younger. It was just so easy to just go to the library and you could just pick something up and all of a sudden you're transported away from, things that are hard in your life. But it's also just, it was such an easy way to like have fun and go on adventures that I just couldn't do. Obviously, still waiting to kind of get my magic powers, but we'll get there. So it was, I guess, a big thing. Like reading was a very big pastime for me. And I started writing. I always knew that I wanted to write an Arabian inspired fantasy because there was not very much representation in the genre when I was growing up. And so as much as I enjoyed fantasy, there was always that sense that I couldn't fully connect with what I was reading. And I really wanted to, I guess, try to help change that. And also, I guess it's a little bit of wish fulfillment, kind of writing the story that I wished was there and I was able to read when I was growing up and in high school and stuff. So I always knew I wanted to write an Arabian-inspired fantasy, and I sort of had, I knew I wanted like a female protagonist who, I guess, wielded a dagger for no reason. I don't know why. But the plot itself came to me when I was kind of like reading around. I was just like reading historical accounts about Arab spice traders because they had a huge monopoly on the spice trade. And basically these merchants would tell people that the spices that they were selling they grew in kind of like really isolated, hard to reach places, places that were guarded by fearsome, magical creatures. And they did this to obviously like ward off competition. But that sort of got me thinking about, spice and magic and making those associations. And I started imagining this world that was isolated, and within this world, this spice grew that could give you magic. And that was really like the jumping off point, because so much conflict arises from that, just that one kind of like piece of world building. You get all this conflict about if your nation had this spice, what would they do? How would they protect it? And what would other nations and other people do if they found out about it? So I'd say that was the spark of inspiration.
I'm just listening. I've already read these, but I'm just listening to all the books again, and I'm just so wrapped. I want to start off with or I guess I already asked a question. I want to ask another question about I felt like a theme that kind of all of your books were talking about in some ways or another was this like line between protection and like not telling people things. Like, so this idea of choice and information and knowledge and protection kind of all swirling in this really kind of nebulous atmosphere. So I wanted to know if you all talk about how your characters approach this balancing act of protection and secrets, like this sort of how much do you tell people? Do you tell people everything kind of thing? Do you want to start, Kaylee?
Sure. Yeah, honestly, there was kind of like a twofold in my book with that sort of concept. You have Calla, who doesn't tell anyone about the kind of being she is. She's not just a witch. She has this other kind of magic called siphon, and it's considered a curse because she's very dangerous. Who kind of doesn't share information because as self-preservation. Um, and then you have Gideon, who is one of her love interests, and he doesn't share information because he does think it's helping people and it's protecting people outside of himself. So it's like kind of seeing how both of those things and like not trusting yourself as well as the people that you're with both kind of have different consequences. Like if Calla had been more open, and less guarded, she might have learned how to, like, love herself a lot quicker, which is, like, really the overarching arc that she goes through in the book is, like, self-identity and how she accepts herself, which is definitely, like, a parallel for, like, my queerness and how it took a very long time to, like, reach that point in adulthood of realizing that like I'm a whole person and like people who only want to acknowledge certain parts of me are not like necessarily people I need to be in my life. And like I was probably very like guarded and protected of myself for a very long time, but now that I've learned how to tell people like secrets or like whatever metaphor for coming out it would be, I now know like I can cut people off safely and like have relationships. I don't have to like protect that part of myself as much. And then with Gideon, like the consequences of him not telling anyone, I'm not going to spoil the book, but him kind of not telling anyone anything because he thinks he has to put all the weight on his shoulders, and just showing what happens when you communicate better and like really trusting the people around you. Like there could be ruinous consequences always. um but yeah, so I think like the secrets, the protection bits, I definitely in my books really wanted to go through the spectrums of like so many different experiences, and like the whole book is about being able to choose your own destiny and your own fate, like no matter if the choices, like the consequences of your choices are good or bad, like as long as you're driving them, honestly that's what matters. So I kind of wanted to show the spectrum of like the different types of uh examples that you could have with all of that, and like how they can lead to the same exact outcome, but at least like you did it yourself. So yeah, if that answered the question at all.
That was a very good answer. So I will go next. My characters have a lot of secrets. I was trying to think about like what I could talk about that wouldn't spoil it completely, because it is a bit of a mystery, and it's also a dual point of view. So they both have these big secrets throughout the whole book, and they're mostly keeping them from one another. Like the reader knows them, but the characters don't necessarily. For example, Roz, who is the female point of view character, she is secretly a rebel, but she's also a disciple. And so the disciples in the world are the people who have magic and therefore are considered blessed by a saint. And Roz has this magic, but she feels like super guilty about having it, because her family was not magical, at least her dad wasn't. And his whole thing was that he was rejecting the saints and rejecting the way that the city was set up. And so when she does get magic, she feels like she's essentially betraying her upbringing and letting down her family. And so she joins the rebellion anyway and becomes the only disciple to join the rebellion. But then when she cross paths with Damien, she does not tell him right away that she is a rebel, which is probably the biggest secret that she keeps from him for most of the book. But the reader, of course, knows that she's a rebel. And then on the other hand, Damien has all this guilt over something that he's done that he can't tell her. And I can't tell you, but I don't have guilt about it the way he does. But basically, he's also got this secondary guilt about how he's starting to question the system as well, even though he's supposed to be part of it. Like he's an officer, or what passes for an officer in this world, of security. And he's starting to have all these questions as like, maybe the system is not so great. Maybe our belief system is not so great. And he has to keep this a secret because if people knew that he was questioning the system that he is upholding, they would probably have quite a few questions for him, considering they're supposed to follow him. So he's got all this guilt over situations, but also over his personal thoughts, I guess, if that makes sense. And I think I wrote that because I really connected to that as somebody who I wasn't fully like tapped into a belief system at any time, but I was definitely very intertwined with a belief system. And obviously, this is going to be a totally different experience for everyone, but I reached a point where, you start to look at stuff and think about stuff and feel like this isn't right for me. Like it doesn't sit right for me and it's not what I want. But then you feel guilty about it because you've got all these people that are part of this system that you're in, and you don't want to lose those people and you don't want them to start hating you or anything like that. So that's his secret that he's really fighting with, and he's lying to people, but when he's pretending that he still really believes in what he's doing. And so over the course of the book, I think he starts to move away from that and be more open, at least at the end. With Roz, he just admits that he agrees with her more than he would like to say. And yeah, I think they're both trying to protect themselves throughout the whole book with these secrets. And again, that's another thing I connect to. I like to keep things to myself because I don't want other people to look at me and think like negatively of me or think I look weak in any situation. And so I think both of these main characters do that a lot too. So maybe I was kind of projecting a little bit there. But yeah, I think that's the main things. But they're definitely both very secretive at the beginning, and then they kind of open up to one another over the course of the book.
I think Imani kind of has a similar actually experience from the sounds of it to Damien, in the sense that, she's raised in this very sheltered environment. So basically her city, the nation that she lives in, is hidden from the world. They have magic and they've kind of like magically cut themselves off from everyone else. No one knows that they exist in the desert. And her council, the ruling council, has done this. They've said it's to protect them and also because it's kind of like a divine mandate. And so Imani Imani comes from a very privileged and extremely sheltered circumstance. Her clan is very privileged, and sort of adding on top of that is the fact that her city, her people are also very insular and sort of inward looking. And so it's a really big shock for her when she learns that these are kind of spoilers, but not really, because it sort of happens at the start of the book. But anyway, if you don't want to know this, maybe just mute me right now. But basically she discovers, she thought her brother was dead, but he might be alive. And not only might he be alive, but he might actually be across the sands, where her council told her that, there's nothing over there. It's a wasteland. But now she's learning that there might actually be cities and kingdoms and civilizations just like theirs. And so that's a huge shock to her. And she spends a lot of the book kind of grappling with what the council has told her, because she is like the epitome of a dutiful soldier. But as she confronts the world outside of her world, and she learns that things are not exactly what the council has told her, and she's also confronted by things like poverty and war and colonialism. It's just a huge, it really shakes her identity. And she spends a long time kind of grappling with that and coming to terms with the fact that what she has built her identity on is a lie, really, which I think is a huge soul-changing thing that anyone could go through. But so this kind of idea of secrecy, all the characters keep secrets from each other, but I think in terms of just answering this question, I would talk about mainly the council and how they lie to the people and don't tell them about what's happening outside. And for them, it's, they're trying to protect their people, and they're upholding this belief system that they have. And that really feeds into the novel's exploration of this idea of kind of us versus them, isolationism versus globalism, kind of turning away and hiding from the truth because it's uncomfortable, or it's, it's just too difficult to deal with, and you're just kind of going to focus on yourself. So that was kind of how I kind of used that idea of keeping secrets to protect people, but also to, to discuss this idea of at what cost do we protect ourselves? At what cost do we shield ourselves from the truth? And, how much is our own comfort and our own sort of identity worth when there are people out there who are suffering, and you could do something to help them or to alleviate that. So yeah, but everyone keeps secrets. I don't know why. I just like, I think I just like shifty characters, maybe, I'm not sure. But yeah, so there is sort of this element of, I guess, mystery and who's hiding what and what people's intentions are. And that was just because I kind of find that fun, but yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think Lux, who's the female main character in my book, Lux Ravel, hence the book, she has a big secret. We've discovered in chapter 1 that her magic doesn't work the same as the rest of her family. So the Ravel family has the magic of enchantment. They can enchant anyone who gives them a jewel into feeling whatever the Ravel wants them to feel, or seeing whatever they want them to see, which makes for them like really great performers and entertainers, because people come to their big circus tent and the Ravels perform, they give everyone booze, everyone loosens up, and then they use their magic. So they paid the admission fee in jewels, and they use their magic to make sure everyone is having the best time. And that's how they make their money. But Lux's magic works a little bit differently than the rest of her family, and we learned that right away. And she is dying to tell them how it works. There's one family member who knows, and the rest, it's a big secret. And originally when I wrote that everyone knew, and one, there wasn't a lot of tension around that, but two, there are 5 magical families on the island, and one of them are mind readers, and they can hear all thoughts, and that makes any secret on the island like spreads like wildfire. So I'm like, okay, she has 96 aunts, uncles, cousins, step cousins, like the Ravel family is huge. How can she have this magic that completely changes the game? Because if she can get away around the cost of magic, then anyone else can get out of the cost of magic. They just have to like torture her to find out she did it, essentially. So there's no way this could be kept a secret. So then I had to go back and rework it so that her family doesn't know. And it's killing her to keep this secret, because it puts a wedge between her and her best friends, who are her cousins. She gets a lot of rewards and clout. She becomes the star because of her magic, because everyone thinks she's the best because of her magic. And so she's got a tremendous amount of guilt about that. It creates a wedge with the rest of the family. And there's nothing she wants to do more than tell them, but she can't because it's too dangerous. Because if everybody finds out, then the Revels lose their only advantage. And they really, really need an advantage because there's all sorts of bad guys coming for them all the time, including time travelers, which is a very bad idea as a villain because that's very complicated. But anyways, so yeah, it's just different. It sounds a little bit more like Gideon in A Ruinous Fate, where this is more for like the preservation of other people or taking care of other people. And I guess the moral of the story for Lux is she has to come to terms with at what cost can she keep this secret and hold the weight of the family's survival on her shoulders when no one else even realizes necessarily what bad shape they're in and how desperate their need is for her assistance.
Can I jump in with something super quick? I just want to say I think it's like it's so bold when people do time travel in books. Like I think it's incredible. I literally made my forest setting in my book like impervious to outside time just so I didn't have to keep a timeline of what was going on with.
Yeah, I was literally like, because in my book people can have like different affinities, but I was like, but not with time. That breaks the rules. Don't ask why, okay? It just does.
Yeah, it was good.
I was just gonna say my entire copy editing experience, I think, was just people being like, "How many days has passed in this scene?" And I'm like, "I don't know."
It was more ambitious than I realized going into it. It's like, oh, this would be so cool, and like they don't travel. So
Well,
magic always has a cost, and the cost of the magic in Revel for time travel is however far back a time travel travels, they have to age 100 times that. So if they want to travel back a month, then they age 100 months, and that's like almost a decade, and you lose a decade of your life right away, and you look a decade older. So people really travel in small, like manipulative increments. But they change, it completely rewrites history. And so I think, oh my God, my copy editors are brilliant and I need to, I don't know, like buy them a pony or something. And two, I had 16 different timelines. Like it was the craziest like spreadsheet, and I will probably never do that again.
Yeah, I loved that there was like a very concrete cost to the time travel. Otherwise it would get to be a lot and to be a little unhinged.
And then my villains are too powerful and I can just redo anything. So it kept them in line too.
hmm I want to ask some questions about the books in more detail. So I think I'm going to start with the question about A Ruinous Fate. So there's a group cast in A Ruinous Fate. And there are some really, really charming characters that kind of like grew on me. And some have, throughout the book, they kind of are fighting, obviously, for top space in your heart. So I wanted to know, how is it to balance their relationships and separate stories in relation to Calla's story? Like, how did you balance that?
Yeah. So many character sheets. Writing, I knew it was going to be really vicious writing an ensemble cast this big. There's 8 main characters. Um, but it's a 4-book series and I really wanted this to be it would like kind of the epic fantasies I used to read. I wanted it to be like so expansive this and show off such a spectrum of things. Like I wanted to have the room to have all the spectrum of different identities that I really wanted to include. I'm bi, so like all of my different kinds of relationships that I've had, and with a large cast, I really got to do that. And when it came to like balancing them all together, the I think like the top 2 questions that I really kept in mind while I was writing it is I wanted every single person in the group to have their own agency and their own story. And even though Cal is the pivotal main character, I really wanted them to have their own goals for what was going on in the plot. And then I also wanted I wanted them to be together for a reason more than circumstance. And it's really hard to build out that many characters in just, like, one book. Like, it's gonna take time. It's a larger series, which I will never do again, but that's a different thing. But I definitely just kind of, prior prioritizing, like, the way I told their backstories and, um, like, giving snippets of the familiarity they already have. One of my favorite things about the relationship with, Calla and Ezra is that they're love interests that already have a very big familiarity with, each other on page 1, like, from the start. They have a history, they're exes, and so I that's kind of established, and then she has a new love interest, like, kind of, like, literally hit her in the face, in the book, and so, like, kind of making sure I can balance how much you get to know, like, you're getting to know Gideon a little bit because we kind of already know that she knows Ezra, and then when it comes to, like, prioritizing Calla's story, um that was the second half of the question, right? I I always end up talking and, like, I have the memory of a goldfish, but, but yeah, like, prioritizing Calla's story, amongst all of theirs and, like, I really just knew that she was gonna be, like, the driving force with, like, the plot, like, where we were going. So, I knew, like, no matter what, they were going on this journey with her, so make like, that's the top tier, but making sure everyone else has their own reason for having the same goals as she does. Um, like I like Hannah and Delphine want to protect her because they're her best friends, but also like kind of what's in it for them because it's also very dangerous for them to go on this journey. And then Gideon comes into the mix because he has his own goal that just so happens to like meet up with hers. And then you know, Gideon's friends and Ezra are kind of like dragged headfirst into it too. But yeah, just making sure everyone kind of has their own agency. I don't know if I answered any of that. Hopefully that was good.
No, I love the idea of them all having their own motivations, their own ambitions, their own kind of driving forces. Because I think you definitely in Aruna's Fate get that feeling, like the balance between, you know, the things that you're shown on the page versus like their hidden depths, I think is really well explored slash, you know, teased, I guess. And obviously like it will only kind of evolve as the books continue.
I'm glad. Yeah, it's kind of like I knew I wouldn't have the space to do every single character and it's like just turning in book 2. It's like the things I started to tease in book 1, I really get to like go into more depth with different characters. And then book 3, it's like a different set of characters and by the time this all like culminates together, it's like hopefully you kind of have a clear picture of like everyone's background and why they're still here. Um yeah.
So moving on to Spice Road, you talked a little bit about it, but Amani's relationship with her brother and this idea, I think I'm really fascinated with this idea of not knowing things about like the ones we love. I think we have this idea that like we know everything about the people we love and like our family members. And I think it's really interesting when that's explored more in depth and like more complexly. So I wanted to know, did you always know that their relationship was going to be kind of a central piece or like the jumping off point for Spice Road? And was their relationship always similar in every draft, or like did it kind of change or evolve like throughout?
It definitely changed. A lot has changed. The Spice Road went through a pretty intensive editorial process, and there's so much. But in order, I guess the easiest way I've been able to kind of explain how intense the revision process has been is when I tell people that so it used to be dual POV and now it's one POV, and it used to be in third person, now it's in first person present. So that kind of gives you an idea of the degree of change and you know, things that were taken out. So that specific dynamic, I guess, where Amani doesn't know things about her brother and also her sister, like, you know, what she's kind of doing in the background, that was something that kind of developed later, as I sort of like zeroed in on this on the draft, which is the book now. The focus on family was always the central. That was always the kind of, like you said, like the jumping off point. That was always going to be like the heart of the book. And Imani was always in this position where she needs to save her siblings, and she's kind of contending with the world, and as she's saving her siblings, she's realizing that she also can't just kind of save them and then bring them back to this like little bubble of hers. Now that she's out in the world, she needs to engage with it. But once I sort of hit that theme about not knowing what your siblings, not knowing everything about them, it felt right. It just felt so significant. And I think it's something I hope that a lot of people can kind of sort of resonate with. I know, like, I grew up with 2 older brothers, and it's kind of just this feeling, I guess, at some point in your teenage years. It's not even just with siblings. It can be like your parents or your cousins or, found family, just people you're really close to, your friends, where you just, it sort of occurs to you that, and this sounds so, I don't know, this probably sounds so obvious. I don't know if it's because like I'm an adult now and it's, but you sort of just realize like, hey, they have lives like outside of me and outside of like what we do together, and they have other people that they love, and they have other passions and things they care about, and they might have beliefs that are so strong that they can almost they can be more important than maybe the things that we do together. They have to pursue this thing because it's so important to them, this truth. And sometimes it doesn't have to be that extreme. It can just be this, this idea when you see like a family member or a close friend, they get like a partner, or, maybe they move away for a new job or something. And it's just coming to terms with that idea that people can change and people can have lives, and things that are happening that you might not see. And as I say it, I just feel like that's such an obvious thing. But I remember like kind of being a teenager and that you kind of get this sense of like a little bit of like hurt, and you're kind of like, oh, but what about us? Like, so I felt like that was like a pretty powerful theme, a pretty powerful driving force between siblings. And I think it was all the more powerful because her brother, the things that he gets caught up with and the things that he cares about are just so big. They're so like they're kind of like world shattering for her, because it's not just about like, oh, he's fallen in love with someone, slight spoiler, like he's fallen in love with this this rebel in another city. It's the idea that there's a rebellion in another city, there's another city, there's colonialists and all this conflict happening out there. And Imani's just sort of desperate to just go back to how things were, and she just wants to hold on to the life that was. And I think that's kind of part of growing up, but I think that we never stop doing that as people. This sort of feeling of change, and life is always kind of moving. You want to sort of like hit the pause button when things are really happy and just be like, this is where I want to be. But that's just not reality. And I think that she has a tough time kind of coming to terms with that. So yeah, once I kind of like came upon that theme, I knew that that's what I wanted to kind of build the story around, because it felt pretty powerful to me.
Yeah, I think that I think it's an important turning or like point in someone's life, our individual lives, when we start seeing people, and specifically family, but also other people, right? We start seeing them less in relation to like our relationship with them and like them as a person, right? So I feel like, when you first realize that like your parent figure is like a person as well, and not just, a parent to you, I think that's like
it's huge. And I think like I recently became a parent, and you it hit me then when I was like, oh, but I'm still me. I'm still a person. I still have all these things in my life and things I need to learn and better myself. But I know that, like my child doesn't see that. Like it's just I'm their parent. And that's fine. That's part of, I guess, like when a child grows up, it's part of like keeping them protected and giving them that, affording them that chance to enjoy that safety and security when they grow up. But yeah, I think it's a pretty surreal experience when you realize that. Yeah.
Okay, so Revel is the only standalone fantasy world here. And I wanted to know if you ever thought it would not fit into one book. And was it always thought of as a standalone? But if you could explore one piece of the world or like a side character, for example, what would you want to explore further? So I guess it's like a three-prong kind of question.
I will try to remember all the prongs. Revel, I always knew it would fit into this book in terms of like this. I knew this was the story I wanted to tell, and I knew that it would have a satisfying ending in this book. As a reader, I really, if there's ever a cliffhanger in a book, I won't read it until the next one comes out. I'm like very impatient. And so as a reader, I like a satisfying ending immediately so that I could go grab the next one immediately. So I made an effort to make sure that everything got wrapped up. But I sort of thought this was a world I would like use again. It really took me a long time to build this world. And it wasn't until I started talking to editors where every single one of them was like, well, this is clearly a standalone. And I was like, yes, that's what I was planning the whole time. Um, I had thought I left like the slightest string in an earlier version, like open enough where we could grab onto that and go if we needed to. I was kind of playing it both ways. But I think the story, I mean, editors know what they're doing. I think the story is really wrapped up to the max it can be wrapped up. In terms of side characters, I do think there is a particular side character that I really like and a lot of early readers have really liked, whose story is not all the way wrapped up and maybe has a romantic string that's still not tied. Um, but because everyone almost dies and some people do, I'm not going to say who that is. Um, yeah, but that would possibly be fun. But there's another part of me that's sort of relieved it's a standalone. Like it's nice to be writing something totally separate now and just it's a process I'm familiar with from what I can tell from author friends. It seems like sequels are really, really hard. And so I'm glad I'm doing something else that's really hard and not a sequel in that way. That's a relief. And if I think also just sequels can be complicated in ways that, originally I was just thinking in terms of the longevity of a story and I was excited about it. But now that I'm not doing it, there is a bit of relief. Um, there has like we do have ideas in terms of using the same world again, even if it's not necessarily the character, but the same families perhaps at a different point in history. I think that would be really cool or really fun. So in terms of some sort of expansion, I think that would be it. But for the main story that's told, I think the story is told how it should be told, and I'm not going to touch it. Did I hit all three prongs?
Yeah, no, that
Okay,
was what
good.
I was thinking about when I was writing that question to you. Like this idea of like not necessarily a sequel in the sense of the same characters, the same sort of story, but yeah, like a prequel or yeah, kind of what you were talking about before, like pieces of the island at a different point in time.
No, I like that. And also the idea, so like this book really focuses on the Revels and their magical enchantments. But there are 4 other kinds of magic, including the time travelers. And then there's magical healers who can only heal if they transfer the ailment to a willing party. So then there's someone else is always suffering. And that comes with like a lot of psychological things. Mind readers trying to date. I always think that's like super fantastic. I love it's like my id list is like, yes, if there's a mind reader who's trying to date but hearing all the terrible things people think, like I love that. So I think there are ways to play with it. But right now it's just kind of like it came out 2 weeks ago and I'm just letting it do its thing. I'm not gonna touch it for a while.
Yeah, right now is like pretty soon after to like embark on the prequel or whatever.
Exactly. So we'll just let it simmer.
And then for Seven Faceless Saints, I really loved the world building. I specifically loved like both the world building of the magic, but also the world building of the history or like the past world building, I guess, is maybe how one could describe it. So I wanted to know if you could chat about how you first approached the world, and what was your favorite and or hardest piece of the world to create.
Okay, well, in terms of creating the world, I think anyone who's watched me talk on any other kind of panel knows that I'm very into like historical stuff. And I'm not the kind of person who can just pull a world from the ether and be like, here it is, I'm going to make up all these things. I read a ton of historical, just like articles and stuff. And I'll go all over the internet trying to find something that just gives me an idea as to like, that's a good idea. I need to make a world out of that because I tend to write like historical fantasy. And this actually started out as a historical fantasy, and then all the history was removed because, like, combined with the magic, it was too much. So, in terms of the world for Seven Faceless Saints, it was originally inspired by well, it's inspired by Florence, but it was more specific than that. Like at the end, and I'm gonna say right now, I did this research like 3 years ago. So if I mess anything up and there are historians watching this, I'm very sorry. I'm sure I will get something wrong. But so essentially, I was researching Florence, and I think it was the end of the like medieval era into the early Renaissance. And the city, it was a city state, and it was run by these guilds, and there were 7 major guilds and then a bunch of medium and minor guilds. So I kind of took this idea of the 7 major guilds and thought like that would be really cool if I had the 7 guilds, but instead of them each having a different skill, which is what they had, they were broken up by like craft and skill and stuff like that. It'd be cool if they had a different magical skill. So I decided to take that and kind of use that to build my world. And in the story, it actually starts out, Roz's first chapter is at like this night market. And that's actually a thing that when these guilds ran the city, they would like hold their own markets where they would sell their wares. And even Damien's job, like he's the security officer. So at the same time, these guilds, they had like city watchmen, I think is what they were called. And they were basically in the city to protect the guilds. And so that's why the security officers in Ambracia, which I always say that like it's a German word. It's not. I just also speak German. But that's what the city is. So basically these officers are protecting the guilds and the magic users in the city. And that's why they're not really protecting the rest of the people. And in terms of the rebellion, there was actually at the same time well, a bit later, I guess. It was the end of the 13th century, I think. There was a rebellion or a revolt between the laborers that weren't part of a guild going against like all these guilds that were running the city. And so essentially they were upset because they weren't part of a guild and therefore they didn't have any like political power and they didn't have money because the guilds were really protected from the rest of the city or the outside of the city. So they didn't really have competition. So they were having a great time in Florence. So this revolt happened, and I won't go into too much more history because some people are probably super not interested in that. But that was like the main idea between these 7 magical guilds that are very religious in a fake religious kind of way, and these rebels who go up against this system because they don't feel that they're being treated fairly. And like I said, it started out being a lot more historical, but because there were so many different terms and stuff for all the different roles and everything, we ended up just like with my agent, we ended up cutting all of that and just making it a straight fantasy. But I do like getting these kind of questions because I like to go back and explain all the stuff I didn't get to keep that was very historically accurate and sadly did not make it into the final version.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite questions to ask about world building. All the pieces that don't make it in, and like, you know, obviously space and whatever is like a huge factor, and maybe also for series, like, you know, maybe there's like future plans for it. But I'm always really interested in what parts you like had in your mind, but then had to get cut like somehow or whatever.
A lot of it got cut. And I totally forgot the second part of the question, which was what was my favorite part to write? Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
So I think my favorite piece to create was like, I didn't get to use a lot of it in the end, but it was like the backstory between the saints. the main saints were like chaos and patience, which you see at the very beginning of the book. It starts with a piece of the lore, I guess. And that really goes further in book 2. It's not super big in book 1, but I just liked creating this dynamic between what people considered the original saints. So I thought that was really fun, and to see how like the interactions between characters in the modern day like parallels that. And I think the hardest part to create, I couldn't think of a specific one part. I think the problem was in trying to use all of this magical world building and then also have to put together like the murder mystery and the political elements, and then there's a war going on and you have to explain why this war is happening, and there was just so much that I had to like really pick and choose which world building elements I wanted to include, and how they all were interconnected. So there was a lot of adding and then taking away and then re-adding and then cutting a whole bunch of it. And yeah, it was just trying to find the right balance between all of that stuff. I think that was the most difficult part.
Okay. If anyone has any questions, also please leave them. I totally forgot to say that earlier, but just because I didn't say that earlier, I'm just going to try to ask a quick one. So get your questions in now. I have a question, which was, what movie, TV series, book, I don't know, you could expand this to anything, right? Like music, just anything, right? So what would you rewatch, reread, re-see, re-listen to over and over again for inspiration? Maya, do you want to start?
Ooh, for Spice Road specifically, I think anything Assassin's Creed kind of gets me into the zone. I'd say the games, the first Assassin's Creed, which is really, really old, and if you hate bad graphics, you probably won't enjoy it. But they're kind of remaking. They're remaking it. I think it's called Mirage. But yeah, Assassin's Creed, the movie as well, which I know people have mixed feelings about, but I kind of enjoyed it. And I really enjoy playing when I want to get into like a really classical sort of fantasy mood. I like to play Skyrim, Morrowind, Oblivion, like just that kind of the Elder Scrolls series, because it's just so, obviously it's a European setting, across the various games, and Spice Road is an Arabian fantasy, but it's just such a classic fantasy that it just kind of gets me into that feeling. So I'd say I'd probably, whenever I'm just like sort of in need of inspiration, I just kind of replay those games, or I listen to the soundtrack or whatever.
I watch Howl's Moving Castle about 8,000 times a week. That's not even an exaggeration. That is my background noise forever. And it probably kind of made its way into like inspiring my book because I've read it since I was a kid. And I like the idea of a magic system that is very flexible and not necessarily like super strict. I like a little bit of whimsy because I like that like anything could happen. So that definitely is kind of, and for some people hate that, some people love it. So but I definitely kind of liked the idea of like expanding my world, like almost anything is possible, like making rules but not making them so rigid that they can't like be broken. Um and that's probably what I most consistently consume is that or like Barbie movies, but that's neither here nor there.
I'll go next, except my answer is not very good because I feel like I don't rewatch or read a lot of stuff. Like I never watch movies because I don't have the patience to sit through movies, and everything I watch is like sitcoms that are not inspiring. But I think what I do is I read books that I really love, like the prose of. And I feel like just reading those, I always reread Laini Taylor, Daughter of Smoke and Bone, because I just feel like the world is so cool. Even though it's like real world, there's so much magic and world building and stuff. And just her writing is so beautiful. Same with Strange the Dreamer. I literally reread chapters of those just to like get in the mood of good fantasy writing or what I feel like is good fantasy writing. Um, and so I do that. I just go through my favorite books that I think are beautifully written and just read like snippets of them so that because if I'm writing fantasy, I am not usually reading it. I'm usually reading rom-coms or something like that. So if I'm not feeling inspired, I'll just read a chapter or two from one of my favorite beautiful fantasy books, and that kind of gets me back into the zone. And that's probably the only thing I do, honestly.
I actually do the same thing, MK, with Laini Taylor's books. Like when I need inspiration, I'll go read the prologue of Strange the Dreamer again, and then try not to cry by how perfect it is, and then move on. But I'm also, and I don't have between writing and other things, like I don't have time for movies. I'll just fall asleep. But I watch Pride and Prejudice, the 2005 version, like often when I'm falling asleep, and I find that like that movie is always one. I love the book, but the movie's fascinating to me because they took this huge story and they managed to like capture a certain vibe and have very few scenes overall, but tell like a very compelling romance. And so building romantic tension without the entire world weighing on them, without like magical fantasy stakes, is something that I'm always trying to understand. So that's when I love to rewatch. Uh, and then I'm like a huge fan of Breaking Bad too, and just like the idea of taking a good character and slowly but very convincingly making them bad. I love that. I haven't accomplished that in my writing, but that's goals for me one day.
Okay, so we have a one quick question. We have a few, but like I'm gonna pick one. And it's current recommended reads. Um, I don't know who Lisa, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. Well, I'm kind of making my way through other 2023 debuts right now, and I love Kat Bakewell's Flower Heart. It's like so good. It's like cottagecore fantasy. It's very romantic. It's whimsical. She is a Haunting is next on my list too, so I recommend that one too. Pass it on from there.
I am reading, well, I'm almost finished with The Daughters of Izdihar by Hadir Elsbai. So it's an Egyptian-inspired feminist, sapphic political fantasy, I think would be the way to kind of sum it up. But it's very powerful. It's very poignant, and the world building is beautiful. And yeah, I just think it's I don't know. I'm really enjoying it. I would recommend it. I'm almost finished with it. So yeah, I think it came out in January. It's not a young adult. I think it's an adult fantasy, but it's very good.
I just started Bloodmarked. I have been waiting to turn in my second book at it so I can read it. My partner read it before me and has been begging me to read it so we could discuss it. But Legendborn was like one of my favorite fantasy books, so I'm really excited for this one. And then as far as like 2023 debuts, specifically, Sing Me to Sleep by Gabby Burton. I cannot wait for that book to come out. I just have a feeling it's gonna bring like the siren trend back in full force, and I love sirens. So
Okay, found my unmute. As I said, I don't read a lot of fantasy when I'm writing fantasy, and I have been on deadline for a while, so I've been reading like really short romances that are, not things that I would necessarily recommend, but like they're fun. But I have been reading a couple books very slowly. I just started Dark Water Daughter by H.M. Long, which is her newest fantasy, I believe. And I'm only like 2 chapters in. I started it yesterday, but so far it's good. And I also am slowly reading Blood Debts by Terry Benton Walker. Did I get his last name right? Yes, Terry J. Benton Walker. And it's just a beautiful setting. Like it's really, I'm not very far in that one either because I'm very slow, like I said. But it's set in like a New Orleans type setting. And it's just, I can just tell that it's going to hurt me, but also be so good. So that's a debut as well, I believe.
also, I'm from right outside New Orleans, and Terry killed it with the New Orleans vibes in that book. It's really good.
I believe that.
Yeah, I basically finished Blood Debts and I don't think I even finished it. I think in my email asking if Terry would do a panel, like what they debut panel, I think I was like, I'm not even done. I think I'm like 70% done. But already I like can tell that I need to discuss this book with you. Like I need to discuss it with so many people right now.
It's
um
very good so far, but I'm not far in, so I don't want to know anything.
yeah. Yeah, all of those books I'm so looking forward to. While we're on the quick subject of the Daughters of Izdahar, I do want to mention that on the what day? On the 5th of March, I'm going to be talking with the Daughters of Izdahar, Ascension, and Bitter Medicine. All three of those adult fantasy debuts. I don't wanted to mention that because I really liked the Daughters of Izdahar. That was another one where I wasn't even, I think it was halfway through as well when I like drafted that email. I was like, and then finishing it, then I was hooked completely. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to these authors. I've left all the bookshop.org links in the description box so that you can go and get your books, add them to your TBR, do all of the things with these books. Thanks for the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. That was totally my bad. I should have asked that earlier. And of course, yeah, just thank you everyone for coming. I was really happy. I'm so happy to do this. And it's really fun also when like the books are out. That way it's much easier to be like, yeah, go pick them up.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you everyone for watching.
Yeah, thanks.
And thank you. This was great.
All right.
Yes, thank you.
I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day. And yeah, we will see you all in the next installment.